Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Annie Osborne, and I am a program director on the Strategic Partnerships team at the National League of Cities. On my team, we bring partners such as, private sector companies, nonprofits, associations, all the groups that are in the ecosystem that local governments work with every day. We bring them to the table. We help facilitate conversations and dialogues between local governments and these groups. And we see outcomes for cities as a result of these conversations. We know that local governments don't and shouldn't operate in a silo. And so we understand how important it is to bring these partnerships to local governments and vice versa, and really help benefit the residents of our cities every day. So today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity, which is a critical issue for local governments, but something where there's really still a lot to learn. Just the other day, we saw a news story about how the city of Oakland, California, declared a state of emergency due to a ransomware attack. We're seeing this in school systems, in local health systems, in different areas of government, and it really, puts the information of residents as well as just the functionings of everyday government at risk. So New Harbor Security is one of our partners who is an expert in this space. They help local governments set up a cybersecurity operation, identify what's important and where the risks are, and help mitigate those risks. This is something where it requires a lot of technical knowledge, but also requires buy-in from political leadership as well. So we're really excited to have New Harbor here today to be speaking with you all about how to build a practical cybersecurity operation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle Smith, who is the Director of Security Product Strategy and Technology for New Harbor Security, who will lead the webinar today. Thanks, and Kyle, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. And thank you again to NLC for allowing me to speak with everybody here today. As Annie introduced, my name is Kyle Smith. I am the Director of Security Product Strategy here at New Harbor Security. Today, I would like to take a few minutes to speak with you all and hopefully provide a strategy for creating and operationalizing a practical cybersecurity operation. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, everyone's microphone will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. Second, please feel free to use the question and answer button within the Zoom to submit any questions. Assuming we have time, I will answer them at the end. If not, I will be happy to reach back out to you if you provide an email and answer those questions after the webinar. Lastly, the webinar will be recorded, and at the end of the meeting, we will get that distributed to those that attended today. All right, and with that being said, let's get started. So why is creating a practical cybersecurity operation important to all of us? Well, unfortunately, the local impacts continue to grow. End of last year, the LA Unified School District was ransomwared. Not only were they ransomed, but they were extorted to prevent the leak of data stolen from the environment. Research has shown that a group called Vice Society gained access to the school district's VPN utilizing leaked credentials found on the dark web. From there, they were able to both ransom and exfiltrate data from the environment. When the ransom was not paid, around 500 gigs of data pertaining to the district, its staff, its employees, its students, etc., was released. More recently, as recent as a couple of weeks ago, the city of Oakland was attacked. They actually ended up declaring a state of emergency. Ransomware has forced the city to take the majority of its IT systems offline. 2 weeks on, and they have not restored services. There are signs up in the Oakland Police Department lobby right now warning residents that systems are down and access services are limited. So not only is this impacting the city's ability to serve its residents, but it's also having a direct impact on the overall public opinion of their environment. Just a day or two later, the city of Modesto had a cyber event. While the extent of the damage is not fully known at this point, they have confirmed that they have an ongoing cybersecurity event It has disabled technology such as the onboard police computers inside patrol vehicles, causing officers to be forced to write down details of calls, etc., rather than utilizing electronic communications that they've been accustomed to. This is an ongoing event, and I'm sure we'll learn more in the coming weeks. But what we can see is that the impact of ransomware and cyber attacks against local government is increasing. And then lastly, in 2018, as I'm sure you all remember, the city of Atlanta was hit by the SamSam ransomware. They had multiple municipal services taken down, including the database servers, their Wi-Fi. They had years worth of work erased. They spent a little over $2.5 million, if memory serves, recovering. And to this day, I think they're still struggling to truly recover everything that went down. So why is this important? It's important because people think of these things as individual problems. People think about, how do I stop ransomware? People think about, how do I stop someone from taking important data off my system? And then people lastly think about, how do I keep my environment up? Sadly, they don't understand the true problem that comes with this complex issue. Let me tell you a bit about the complex issue. So the top threats today are ransomware, private information theft, and disruption of services. Ransomware, you've all heard about, been in the news. Private information theft, this is stealing things like credentials from an environment in order to either, one, extort the organization, or two, to further their intrusion in the environment. And then lastly, it's how do you stop those, or how do you knock those devices over? How do you stop network functioning? Take systems offline. This may be to apply pressure to pay a ransom, or it may just be destructive in nature. These disruption campaigns do occur. Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center is one. Started off as a ransomware attack and escalated to an outright disruption of services. At the height of it, I want to say it was nearly 2 weeks that the hospital had a lack of patient records, as well as some connected devices that they use in the ER were unable to be utilized. As I stated earlier, people tend to try to solve these problems individually, when in fact they have a lot in common. They share common causes of how they start, and they're very much related. Things like user errors, malware, business email compromise or BEC. Sometimes ransomware will publish stolen information. Sometimes disruptive attacks are caused by cryptographic ransomware shutting systems down, either accidentally or intentionally. And sometimes disruptions of key services lead to private information being exfiltrated from the system. So these are interconnected, and as a result, leaders in the space understand that they are security domains. And they have to be thinking about how they want to handle these domains. Traditionally, people have thought about security domains in a more literal sense, breaking them down by asset type or technology, things like systems, services, users, and behaviors. Or they've thought of them as how they relate to their framework of choice, say the CIS Top 18. When looking at security domains in this way, one may break them down categories like prevention, detection, resolution, or remediation. However, people tend to forget that these types of domains or solutions have to be applied in 3 major ways in order to be as effective as possible. First, they need to protect you from the attacks you're expecting. Secondly, sometimes they need to provide you with a mechanism to validate the protections you have before someone else tries to do it for you. And lastly, they need to continuously make sure you understand what's going on so you will notice something changing or something has gotten around your protections, which something always will. Let's take a few minutes and look at some of these elements. On the foundational front, this is going to start with things like your asset inventory. And this goes beyond a standard asset inventory. Historically, people think of this as your servers, your endpoints, etc. This would be expanded to include things like your services, your user identities, your overarching applications that are running on your network. You also want to think about, how are we going to protect stuff actively, meaning your endpoint protection. Do we have managed detection and response capabilities? Do we have EDR capabilities? Your network hardening, so things like, how are we going to make sure that we have the proper ports open and don't allow everyone on the internet to talk to all of our internal servers. Then sort of more the programmatic foundational items. So things like, how are we going to update this environment? How are we going to take care of our patches? What is our acceptable dwell time for vulnerabilities? As well as then application governance, Many cities, especially the larger ones today on the call, probably are hosting an unknown number of applications in the environment. Those applications tend to be an amazing vector to enter the environment as well as steal that data. On the active front, right? So this is where you're utilizing technology, partner, process to basically try to validate via some mechanism that your protections you've laid out in foundational are working. So the first thing I like to talk about is how do you report on your posture? This is to answer the dreaded question that all of us on the call get is when the mayor or your boss or department lead walks into your office and says, "Hey, Kyle, how's our security?" It's one of those incredibly generic questions that has so many different rabbit holes to go down. And taking the time to think about how am I going to report our security posture to others is an important one in order to communicate the effectiveness of your program. This is also things like penetration testing. So this would be having an outsider or an internal team try to break through your security, as well as doing things like compliance checking. So making sure that if you're using a framework like CIS Top 18 or NIST or any of the other really good ones that are out there, how are we lining up? Do we have the right controls in place? Doing things like infrastructure assessments. So this is saying maybe we have a cloud environment. How do we know that cloud environment was configured properly and deployed in a way that is secure by default? So having someone either come in, again, an external or an internal party, validate that that configuration is proper. And then, your threat hunting. So taking the active time to look in your environment to say, is anyone actively in here right now? Are there threats I need to know about? And then the last major category is the continuous category. So this is where you're using, again, you're trying to understand what's going on at all times so that when something changes, you are immediately aware of it. So this is using things like threat intelligence, right? In threat intelligence at all different levels. You need to look at a global view, you need to look at an industry specific view, and you want to look at what threat intel is out there that pertains just to me. You also want to look at things like, is anything in my environment changing, right? So this could be something as simple as configuration management, all the way up through a more complex system to validate your environment to give you either a software bill of materials or an infrastructure bill of materials to make sure that you know when something changes so that you can start looking at the other categories in these elements to make sure that you're covered across the board. External event association, right? So are you being name dropped on the dark web? Is a particular group targeting you? These are things you want to know so you prepare. And then lastly, you want to have a way to do attack disruption, recovery, and remediation. So when something goes boom, what is the process to get there? To bundle this all together, you really need the top element, which I think is kind of the most important one in this group right now. And that's a security strategy. You need to think about, how am I going to balance all the businesses' balanced priorities? How am I going to make sure that I have budget responsibility? How am I going to make sure that I set the proper expectations with the city council, with the mayor, with whoever you need to report this to, so they understand what you're up against and what you're doing and how you're actively moving the ball? As we all know, security changes day in, day out. How do you address this, right? Well, I spent a lot of time talking about the problem space and what you should be thinking about. Now I'm going to give you a couple of steps and we'll walk through and provide you with a checklist that I think will make your life a lot easier. The first thing I want you to do is think about who cares. Who cares about what's going on in cybersecurity in your organization? Who is in a position to understand what you're trying to get done from a delivery perspective? Remember, security is only important to security people. Most other people just want to get their stuff done. So be empathetic. Recognize that leaders you are going to deal with will have their own objectives, and more often than not, security is a friction, not an enabler to what they're trying to get done. Take the time to educate those leaders on what the outcomes of your goals are. Figure out how you're going to share this information about what you're trying to do, so that way you can recruit champions amongst those other leaders. Also remember, this is a two-way street. Understand what they're trying to accomplish so you can work with them to prioritize their needs with the security needs of the organization. Once you do that, you can define the outcomes that they'll care about and the actions they need to take in order to help you get there. So I'd recommend that you make a checklist in order to simplify this entire process. The checklist I'm going to suggest has 4 major components that you will need to populate. First, a list of recommendations. These are recommendations that you are going to make best based upon your expertise in both the organization you work for and your knowledge of cybersecurity. Secondly, the impact, because when your stakeholders read the list of recommendations, you immediately want them to associate what they care about, the outcome, with the recommendation you've provided. Now that you've shown them the recommendation and the impact, you got to do the hard part and tell them what it's going to cost. Sometimes it's time, sometimes it's a change in process, and sometimes it's budget dollars. But there's always going to be a cost based upon how much of that cost they're willing to bear or how complex the project is. You can give them a timeline. I've created this simple checklist that you can take back to your teams and leaders to enable these discussions. On the far left is the list of recommendations I spoke of, followed up by the key stakeholders. Stakeholders may all be departments, as I've outlined here, or perhaps in your organization, there are specific people or even a function within a department. Think long and hard about who the stakeholders are, because it's very important that the right people are brought to the discussion early. Next, talk about the impact. I recommend keeping this very generic. High, medium, low are words that everyone understands, although I've also seen people use red, yellow, or green. Basically, use any simple classification system that everyone in your organization is going to understand. The goal is to help those leaders prioritize the recommendations properly, but also realize that there's a cost. Again, keep it simple and create a legend that works for you and your team. Perhaps high means $10,000 because that's your signing authority. Or maybe high means $100,000, as that's the maximum amount of money you can spend in a single budget year. The specifics will be personal to you and your organization, and all it really matters is that you document it and that everyone is on the same page. Layering both impact and cost allows you to start to think about timeline. I'd encourage you to think about timeline not just as a when will it be done, because that's obviously an end goal. And while some things work that way, like deploying a new piece of technology or hiring an individual, sometimes the timeline is going to be forever, like a vulnerability management program, as an example. That's something you're going to do continually for eternity. There may also be some timeline items that, while important, really should happen later. Maybe the first thing you need is to obtain an accurate asset inventory. It's hard to then later on identify externally accessible vulnerabilities if you don't have an accurate asset inventory to work from. This is why timeline is a really important component to layer on as part of this checklist. Feel free when utilizing this checklist to bounce it off people. It's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time. The goal is to inform the discussion and allow non-security members of your organization to understand why what you do is important and how it will overall protect the organization and make you all stronger. Let's take a couple of minutes and break a couple of these recommendations down. I think we all can agree that having an accurate asset inventory is critically important to the security of most organizations. Because it's important that that asset inventory be holistic across the entire organization, the stakeholders are probably going to be all departments. Perhaps in your environment, those are named individuals. And if so, you'd want to call that out here. Or maybe it's functions within those stakeholder environments. So maybe IT has someone in charge of asset, or your legal office has someone in charge of the overall deployment of the technology and tools they're utilizing. Whatever it is, make sure it's called out. Impact-wise, the result of having an accurate asset inventory is going to be high. This is going to allow you to understand where your gaps are, and more importantly, prioritize investment or solutions later in your security program to make sure you're best protected. Cost here, perhaps it's a medium. I'm defining medium here maybe as it's going to take 50 hours per department, or maybe it's going to cost us some amount of money to buy a technology solution to help us ascertain the actual asset inventory. And timeline wise, I'm saying now. This is hyper important, as I just laid out, in order to build a healthy security program. So perhaps by labeling it now, you can help the other leaders in your organization understand the timeline and impact. Another way we could look at this is executing a vulnerability management program. Perhaps this really is only going to have the stakeholders of the technology department, right? So those that are going to be resolving any vulnerabilities that are established or identified, and a compliance team perhaps that has to validate you to make sure you're meeting your own internal timelines, procedures, policies. Impact on doing a vulnerability management program would also be high. Again, this comes down to understanding your risk, protecting your assets, patching out critical vulnerabilities, and making sure that you are up to date so that when the next attack hits, you are not vulnerable to it. Cost here, maybe it's high. We have the software cost of deploying a piece of technology to help this. We also have the cost this is going to create work for the technology department. This is going to slow down deployments of new things. So we just think about that cost. And timeline here, continuous. A vulnerability management program is only as good as the last time it was executed. So you want this to be continuous. You want to do this on as much of a recurring basis as possible, and you want to call that out on the timeline within the checklist so that everyone understands this is not a one-time thing. Now that you've populated your checklist and you have alignment with the rest of the stakeholders involved, it's time to identify any gaps and think of potential mitigations you may be able to put in place. Some common gaps we see are things like expertise. Perhaps the organization doesn't currently employ a person that knows how to deploy a particular piece of software or utilize a particular program that you need. A common example might be you've identified that you need to deploy a SIEM, right? A security incident and event management platform. Maybe you don't have anybody in staff that can do that. Perhaps a gap could be influence or input into non-security activities. Are you brought in early in the procurement process for new technologies, new software that other departments may be utilizing? How are you expected to protect those environments if you don't know what's being deployed into the environment? How do you gain that influence across the organization? Tools or tool integration. So again, back to the expertise. Maybe you don't own a SIEM. So not only do you not have the expertise to deploy or use one, maybe you don't currently own one. And maybe getting the funding to do that is something that's a challenge in your environment. How can you mitigate some of this? I think first and foremost, it's putting in requests along with their justifications for additional headcount or budget. So understanding what those gaps are, documenting them well, determining what the best way for your organization is to go forward, and then being able to communicate that effectively to the leadership team. Maybe it's increasing your leverage of state and federal resources, whether that's the president's state and local cybersecurity grant program or something at the state level that's offered to you, but learning how to utilize those resources. Maybe it's reaching out to a local group from a technical perspective to get that technical help, to get that overarching security strategy that you need in order to drive your program forward. And then lastly, maybe it's thinking about third-party consulting and managed services. There are many organizations, including New Harbor, that can help you deliver most, if not all, of what we've talked about today. The important thing for all of this is to understand your environment, determine what your gaps are, and what mitigations may work best for you. At the end of the day, this is all about moving the cybersecurity needle forward in meaningful ways. Lastly, remember to measure and communicate. First and foremost, track issues. Issues are going to come up. You want to make sure that as you go through this process, they are documented, tracked, so you can work to resolutions quickly. Create meaningful progress measures, whether this is through a specific laid out structure like a SMART goal, being specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound, or through a means you use internally. What it is, you want to make sure you have meaningful progress measures so you can both understand the progress you're making, determine when you're not meeting that progress, and be able to communicate that out. Identify communities of interest and provide them updates. Transparency is king when it comes to pushing a productive security project. And lastly, over communicate whenever possible. Time and time again, I see the most successful cybersecurity programs are the ones with a competent communicator at the helm, making sure that the entire organization is moving in lockstep to both achieve the organizational goals as well as keep the environment secure and provide the overarching controls needed to make sure that maintains into the future. And that's what I wanted to cover for you all today. A quick thank you to both the National League of Cities as well as Annie for the warm welcome. I think it's incredibly important for local governments to have access to quality cybersecurity help, as you guys are at the forefront of the battleground that is the current cyber landscape. We have about 10 minutes for questions that I can take from the chat. And again, if you have questions after, or if you think of something in a couple of days, feel free to reach out. Thank you very much. We got a few questions that came up throughout the presentation, so let's just quickly go through those and I'll provide answers. The first one is, in an early slide, you listed security strategy as a component. Is this checklist part of the strategy, or do I develop the strategy based upon the checklist? I think it's a bit of both. So obviously, in order to craft the recommendations, you need to come up with a high-level cybersecurity strategy specific to the cybersecurity goals that you have. As you begin to document and utilize the checklist and bring in other stakeholders, at that point, it really allows you to refine that cybersecurity policy and that cybersecurity strategy to be more holistic to the organization and take in the viewpoints of other parts of the organization. And then one came in, when your customers ask about what to do first, what do you tell them? Obviously, this is something that's going to be specific to your organization, depending upon the level of cybersecurity maturity you've achieved thus far. In general, I think it's a really good idea to think about performing a risk assessment holistically across the entire organization. This is going to allow you to understand where to best apply security budget and security muscle based on understanding what the risk of each component is, what the assets involved are, and making sure that you're targeting on your areas that are going to give you the biggest wins in the shortest amounts of time, because we all know that showing progress is the best way to get others to buy into the platform and program. Is there a way to make the checklist smaller? I don't think I have time to talk to all the people that I know are involved in some of my agencies. So I think in general, it's important to keep all the stakeholders abreast to where things are. I think what I would challenge you to think about is, at what level and what depth does each stakeholder need to be informed? Meaning, you have some stakeholders who are going to need to be involved on a daily basis and have daily updates and know exactly what's going on. And you have other stakeholders that maybe a quarterly 2 PowerPoint slide deck on the status is going to be enough. So I think where the time savings you may be able to get from a communication perspective is to really think about kind of what that depth is. Beyond that, trying to think even harder about what stakeholders need to be involved at all, or getting buy-in from certain stakeholders that there's a trust factor and they just want that quick update. So, maybe the attorney's office doesn't need to be involved in every single recommendation that you have, and you can kind of cut them out and just keep them at a high level abreast. The last question we've got thus far, can you give me an example of the communications you're talking about? We do monthly reporting and notifying on security events, but I don't think this fits your description. I think you're 100% right. When speaking about communicating when it comes to these recommendations, I think it's incredibly important that you're communicating the progress, the roadblocks. If you need any help from anyone else in that stakeholder pool, do you need help from them to drive something forward? Do you need someone to help you translate it for a city council, for example? But I think making sure you communicate not only on the more broad notable security events that you're speaking about, but also speaking to the specific recommendations at a level that each stakeholder understands. So one of the hardest things we have as cybersecurity leaders is learning to communicate in a way that cybersecurity lay people will understand. The cybersecurity industry as a whole has thrived on making things overly complex, which is good for cybersecurity business people, but not great for educating people across the world and across your number of teams. Let's see, any other questions? If a risk assessment is one of the first steps you recommend, how do you develop a proposal and scope for this? I'm interested in learning more. There's a lot of ways. So New Harbor can help you do this. There are also things you can think about from the standpoint of what sort of risk framework do you want to use. To the individual who sent that question, I'm happy to get you in connection with someone who can help you directly scope that. But it's definitely a process that it's best to get someone to help you with. I think that is all the questions. If anything else comes up as you noodle on this or think it through, please feel free to reach back out. I will connect those that ask questions that are specific to them with the right people on my side. Again, I want to thank Annie and the NLC for giving us this time, and I'll give you guys all back about 10 minutes of your days. Have a great afternoon, and thanks for attending.